part 2. I'll just keep plowing on. So I just, in my last one, left off on the Swedish reporter standing up at the conference, being like, you just dropped an atomic bomb. So she was shocked that the children were being used without consent. However, she hastened to assure me that the children could be sexually stimulated by adults, even parents, were this for strictly therapeutic reasons, of course. This is what she was trying to, like, this is a bomb, but also we can. Later that afternoon, her young assistant, Judith's young assistant, returned from lunch visibly shaken. She had dined at a private table with international executives of the conference. My paper was hotly contested and largely condemned, since everyone at her table, about 12 men and women, wholeheartedly agreed that children could indeed have loving sex with adults. Okay, so maybe you didn't realize you were in part 2 video of Kinsey's Crime and Consequences. It is true. You have made it here with me. Oh my gosh. Wholeheartedly agreed that children could have loving sex with adults in the 70s. Like, guys, this has been stuff that's been going on for generation after generation to normalize sexualization of children into the days that we are currently in, where you can see what's going on if you just do a quick little search. So she began to realize that the entire field of research, therapy, and education relied on Kinsey's sexual education, the model that he has created through manipulating and terrorizing children for his tables of proof that children are apparently sexual from birth. The role that he plays in the sexual abuse is absurd, and it's about to take over. Okay, let's skip ahead a little bit. And you could even find this this episode of Phil Donahue, and your mind will be blown. In 1990, when some of my child abuse findings were printed in a small circulation book, Phil Donahue, a popular talk show host and Kinsey devotee, telecast Kinsey's general importance to the world. A boy in his audience asked why Kinsey should matter to him. Today, Mr. Donahue instructed the youth, too young to remember, Kinsey was to sexuality what Freud is to psychiatry, what Madame Curie is to radiation, what Einstein is to physics. Come along, this woman, Reisman, saying, holy cow, E doesn't equal MC2. We've based an entire generation of education on sexologists on Kinsey, and Kinsey was a dirty old man. It's disgusting what's about to be read next. I can't even wrap my head around it. So while Donahue contests back that Kinsey was a fine family man, despite what happened to the kids of Table 34. Since 1948, public health report data confirmed the social costs and consequences of this sea of change in the way of America and the rest of the Western worldview of human sexuality. As America's founding moral order has been jettisoned and shift in the standard of judgment has occurred over the last 50 years, it is certain, based on statistical evidence, that our present direction deserves review. It is much worse and more threatening to our children than even Mr. Donahue said. For what happens to society, which has based an entire generation of education of sexologists on Kinsey, and Kinsey was a dirty old man. What can this mean for us all? So she's providing the answers in this book and the proofs to go with it. So we are on part 1. So if you're just finding this video, this is part 2 to the Kinsey Crime and Consequences that we are going through by Judith A. Reisman, PhD. We are the first video up until this point. In the second video has been a personal odyssey by Judith Reisman. It's basically the preface of the book. We are now walking right into Kinsey Crime and Consequences, part 1 Kinsey. It is talking about Kinsey's youth to family man. So that's what we're going to be checking out now. I don't know how much y'all know on this guy. I never know how much to warn people when they're about to open a video that is talking about him, because it's absolutely disgusting, some of the things, most of the things that I am going to share. So chapter 1 is Kinsey's Youth to Family Man. It's interesting that the quote in here is by Pomeroy, Kinsey's co-author in 1972. This is what his own, a guy that works with him says. How was it possible for a sickly religious boy who grew up to be a serious college student with an obvious talent for biology and an abysmal ignorance of sex? How did this young man evolve into a world authority on sexual behavior who could be mentioned in the same breath with Freud? Alfred Kinsey was born in 1894. He grew up in South Orange. He was born in Hoboken, New Jersey. He was 16 when Congress halted the traffic of young girls in the white slave trade in 1910. It was largely to oppose the prostitution that religious women and feminists joined to encourage virtue in women. So you can see historically in here that the erosion of the family was obvious everywhere, as economical, powerful saloon and brothel franchises and organized crime associates corrupted the politics and society. Many families were impelled to leave independent family farms and move to industrialized, impersonal cities. So the targets of these things, brothels, saloons and stuff, were of the Virtuous Women's Coalition, which also dubbed in the Purity Movement. So that's a whole different thing you can look into. Prostitution in general, promiscuity, poverty, child labor, drug and alcohol abuse, everything about the food and diet, disrespect for women, unsanitary conditions, obscene literature. It's looking like a lot of the things that we are dealing with today. The movement bolstered by many male proponents, law enforcement officials, state, federal legislators. So similarly to what we deal with today, where things are opposing our rights to protect ourselves, where we're like, sexual violence is a big thing. And similarly, back then, they're trying to protect their rights in the same exact way. It is statistics that show the operations of women in the hospital of New York City for the removal of one or both ovaries. 65% of those operations were brought about and necessitated because of gonorrheal infection, largely contracted by wives infected by their lawfully wedded husbands. Now, do we think this is true? Or is this because somebody cataloged some of the results of public toleration of adultery and prostitution? Now, there are a lot of ways that we can look at this, and there is a lot of history that surrounds these things. Is it real or not? I tend to think that these things are real because we can see in our society today, what we have. So, commenting on the growing influence of organized vice and crime in merchandising of sex, the police chief of Des Moines, Iowa, reported that neighborhood segregation of brothel and cribs created such a sex market that landladies, by reason of competition, put red lights over their doors displaying charms of girls in the window. In 1908, Edward Bok, editor of the Ladies' Home Journal, implored parents to speak frankly to their children about sex and to stress that there can be but one standard, that of moral equity, which requires the young man to be physically clean before granted the privilege of matrimony. So you've got both sides. You're seeing the effects, the consequences of over-sexualization and people fighting back for it. The famed Helen Keller, blind and deaf after a bout of scarlet fever in her infancy, warned in the same magazine of the same perils of free love. Her article, I Must Speak, candidly addressed the marriage and family life issues. The most common cause of blindness is ophthalmia of the newborn. One pupil in every 3 of the Institution for the Blind in the New York City was blinded by this disease. What is this cause? Her husband had contracted the infectious in relations before or since marriage. The cruelest link in the chain of consequences, says Dr. Prince Morrow, is the mother's innocent agency. She has made a passive, unconscious medium of instilling into the eyes of her newborn babe a poison that extinguishes its sight. It is part of the bitter harvest of the wild oats he has sown. So there is a definite reach here when it comes to the sexualization of men. Ms. Keller noted that the blindness was by no means the most terrible result of pestilent sin. Diseased children reared in poor houses and scores of young, once healthy women died in great pain and misery as a direct result of their husband's sexual irresponsibility. Discussions of the effects of the venereal disease were sorely needed. Some surgeons attribute 3/4 of their surgical operations on women to this disease. 1/4 is a very conservative reckoning. So, in 1948, the sexual behavior in Human Female volume, that was an America Witnessed Successful Women's War Against Alcoholism. Man, oh man. Guys, this is rough. I've read this book years ago, and I've got notes all over this thing. And I'm looking at it now after going through beauty school and divorce and everything, and I'm like, oh my God. It really does lead you to believe, not even to believe, but to acknowledge that all of these sexual endeavors are sold to men. They're not these aren't whorehouses full of men. You know what I mean? Like, oh, come on, ladies. Come on, women. Let's do this. It's like, these are all, I mean, why am I surprised, Kinsey blamed sexual repression for everything from a high rate of divorce, rape, and homosexuality, yet he was in his mid-20s which was hardly a decade of sexual repression. You know what I mean? Rather, it was time when girls bobbed their hair, donned shorts, they shortened their skirts, they rolled up their stockings, By age 36, Kinsey would have been aware of the considerable success of Ordinary Citizens. But he ignored it, and he's gross. Here is some cover illustration for Fighting the Traffic in Young Girls. Super interesting. So a little about Kinsey that you, just think with your brain, is that he lived in a domineering, church-going Methodist household where dancing, tobacco, alcohol, and dating were all forbidden. He had a lot of animosity. Writes, it's funny because it says Kinsey's biographer, which was Pomeroy, which was the guy he was writing sexually perverted books about molesting children with. So I'm just like, are you freaking kidding me? Kinsey explained why he had severed all contact with his parents, blaming his father's domineering personality and his mother's thrift. He literally recalls how he was ineligible to serve in World War I due to his physical condition, a double curvature of the spine, and a possibly defective heart caused by rickets in childhood, bouts of rheumatic fever, and even typhoid. He felt physically inferior to other boys. Goes on to explain how he noted Shakespeare's Hamlet underneath his high school yearbook photograph that says, "Man delights me not, no, nor woman either." How was it possible for a sickly religious boy who grew up to be a serious college student with an obvious talent for biology? Again, this quote, in the same breath of Freud. This was a man who was sadly brought up to be literally full of animosity because of his sexual perversions he was already carrying. The history behind him only proves that more and more as we go into it. His own people who were writing with him sell him out. Oh my word. Just gets worse. So Pomeroy and Christensen and Indiana University, where Kinsey's sex operations were based, Kinsey claims that he was asexual, disinterested in sex, and celibate prior to marrying in 1921. But in 1997, James H. Jones, another pro-Kinsey biographer who had also received support from the university, revealed startling new details about Kinsey's sexual obsessions in his book, Alfred C. Kinsey, A Public/Private Life. Oh, man. Interviewed for a 1998 British television program entitled Kinsey's Pedophiles, Jones asserted, I'm about to wait a second to quote all this because It's just not good. It's literally like, it's like when you find out that you bought a Lucky Charms box and there's no Lucky Charms in it. It's just like shit cereal, you know? There is in no way that the American public in the 1940s and 50s would have sanctioned any form of behavior that violated middle-class morality on the part of the scientist who was telling the public that he was disinterested and giving them simple truth, ... And disclosures of any feature of this private life that violated middle-class morality would have been catastrophic for his career. For Kinsey, life in the closet came complete with a wife, children, and a public image. And again, he preserved at all costs. Kinsey's reputation still in large measures rests upon the image of him that he cultivated during his lifetime, the official mystique. Scrutiny of Kinsey's formative years is imperative to understand how and why he became motivated to conduct his later research, especially his studies of sexual responses in children. Pomeroy reports that Kinsey himself argued that early life experiences largely shape one's adult's behavior. Okay, so those who knew Kinsey would report that he showed no interest in women or sex from, activities. He liked to play piano. Handsome, educated, and athletic suddenly from another perspective. Some said that he resembled the late John F. Kennedy. Pomeroy writes, young Al Kinsey was also known in South Orange High School as the boy who never had a girl. And as a young man, he was ignored or would ignore women. So here's the deal. I'm going to keep going, and then you might figure out why. He devoted most of his time to zoology, biology, sociology, and psychology. Let's just move down even further. You got several hours in Pavlovian concepts of control throughout conditional reflex. Pavlov's use of dogs as subjects to detect the conditioned reflex. Do you know what that means? Do ya? So he's conducting research on dogs and insects. Well, animals and insects. So, psychological reaction to environmental stimuli that shape the development of behavioralism. So I would say that you can make your own attempts to understand what that means. But to then know that he moves on to children. Think about it. People who torture pets, animals, kill bugs on purpose, whatever, not just any bugs, obviously, but torture, are red flags to what? Being a serial killer. So if people are testing out the stimuli on animals, on dogs, for their sexual deviancy, and then move on to the children, is that really unheard of, honestly? So here we got a guy who was not feeling the best about himself, but then tests out all these scientific theories on vulnerable beings. The eugenics, Jones identifies Kinsey as one of the scholarly pre-World War II eugenics who issued a terrifying call for mass sterilization in lower-level Americans and a breeding plan for the superior class. So if you don't have any idea about Planned Parenthood or anything that calls for sterilization in children, and now you're seeing that the world is now okay with children being able to choose their genders at the young age of 7, this is the stuff we're looking at. These are things that this led to this, led to this. So now we are looking specifically into the history of what that means. This is crazy when you see this for yourself. I implore anyone to get a hold of this book and do your research, because it's not like it just includes little he's or she's or whatever, these facts. These facts, they were backed up by big people. United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization is somebody that would play a huge role inside of Kinsey's elite eugenic league. It is free love and selective breeding. It is similar to genocide in some ways. They just have a lot of things that try to appeal to people that don't maybe feel like themselves. He so decided himself to be. So I would definitely continue on as I am right now. Here we go, continuing on to the next page. So here we go. You're going to see some similarities to today's age and situations. As shy as he was around women, Kinsey was much more at home with young boys. He preferred their company in both outdoor and indoor settings. He joined the Boy Scouts at age 17, and later, as a married man, continued to wear his scout uniform, take boys to nature hikes, and like to sleep alongside them in the tents. The Boy Scout movement, which was founded in Great Britain in 1907, has helped to instill such character traits as honesty, courage, tenacity, cooperation, and devotion to God in the country and tens of millions of boys worldwide. Additionally, millions of men have served as leaders of the Boy Scouts in America, founded in 1910, providing young scouts with positive role models and rewarding experiences. Sadly, however, scouting has too far often been exploited by deviants with less honorable objectives in mind. Claiming that Kinsey's obsession with boys was entirely platonic, Pomeroy and Christensen insist that he led a largely sexless life. Evidence from Kinsey's own writings, however, raised serious questions about his sexual orientation long before publication of Jones. Alfred Kinsey C. Kinsey confirmed his deviancy. Even in college, he opted for the companionship of young boys and youths. A fellow counselor describes Kinsey, then aged 21, as this. His tent, with his nature library of dozens of volumes, was... Oh, my God. Oh! I don't even want to read this. The boys loved Al and couldn't get enough of him. He had a merry eye, a wide smile, and a hearty laugh. Always ready for the latest camp prank. He was just ready to pitch in, and help any kid in trouble. ... Okay, I'm going to get you this. Okay, so what it says here is, note that Pomeroy placed nature library in quotation marks. People in the 1920s would have understood this to mean Kinsey collected nature nudist magazines with drawings and photographs of nude youths and adults. Commenting in the 1920s nudist movement, including the Manifesto of Nudism. Christopher Stevens writes in The Secret and Forbidden. The most important document in the first years of nudism is the manifesto published by Professor George Herman. It read, "The problem of nudity, nude social life, was always the battleground of prudish Pharisees and the honest children of nature, the subject of constant quarrels between senile hypocrites and the fresh, young joy of beauty." So, you've got a pervert inside of a tent sleeping next to young boys, showing them nudes. Is this, yeah. These findings are not only sold out by people he worked with, but some psychologists would argue that this may reveal the origin of Kinsey's nudist photography, pornography collection at Indiana University, which is discussed further on. The biographer James H. Jones confirms that Kinsey received nudist magazines at the family home, certainly an interest in conflict with his public conservative persona. So he is living one way. Obviously, they're laughing at it. Even the people he is working with are like, oh yeah, he was, had a library. Oh yeah. And really your library is not what you think it is. So, years later, Kinsey would write a curious letter to an old scouting friend, perhaps one of the boys with whom he shared his nature library with, to whom he devoted so much time and attention to during his adolescence. God dang. Kinsey wrote, "We did have good times together, and you must understand that from that scout troop, I began to learn some of the things that made it possible for me to do some of the research we are now engaged in." Clearly, Kinsey was not referring to wasp collecting, but the sexual research and experimentation that would eventually result in the publications of male sexuality. According to Pomeroy, Kinsey began to leave scouting and the sexually sterile world of his boyhood behind him when he graduated from high school. Not mentioned is Kinsey's continuing close association with boys through his leadership activities. Bethany Methodist Church, hikes, tons of hikes, is a scouting atmosphere where he could establish relationships with young boys through these activities. This one gets me every time. Indeed, Kinsey so enjoyed the scouting atmosphere that he continued to lead a summer camp program after he was married. He and his wife Clara once examined property with what they thought they could establishing a boys' camp of their own. Though nothing came of it, Kinsey did spend a month at Camp Winona in Maine alone, since Clara now had 2 children. In the book about the male sexuality that he wrote, Kinsey claims that the children are sexual from birth. He argued that most American boys engage in some sort of sexual activity with other boys, that adolescent homosexuality is a common phenomenon, and that males reach their sexual peak as teenagers. True or false, it is not unreasonable to speculate that Kinsey observed at least some sexual activity among the boys with whom he had been closely associated with in the Boy Scouts or the boys' clubs. He was a pedist. A report by Patrick Boyle, author of Scouts Honor, Sexual Abuse in America's Most Trusted Institution, describes Kinsey's role in removing a warning about masturbation, removed from the Scout Handbook. According to Boyle, an early edition of the handbook advised Scoutmasters, because boys of scouting age are naturally curious about sex, you may discover or hear about incidents of sexual experimentation among troop members. Incidents of sexual experimentation call for a private and thorough investigation and frank discussion with those involved. Boyle recalls Kinsey's response when the BSA sought this advice for updating the manual in 1947. Our years of research have failed to disclose any clear-cut cases of harm resulting from masturbation, although we have had thousands of cases of boys who have in their years their lives ruined by worrying over masturbation. We should be glad to serve wherever the Boy Scouts can use factual material. So the Boy Scouts Association, they dropped the discussion of masturbation from the handbook entirely after that. Why did this guy have any real sort of say? This is wild. The Kinsey-backed move increased the vulnerability of young scouts to sexual abuse by older peers and adult pedists. Some accounts claim that Kinsey attended church regularly as a child and remained devout until he entered college, but an incident involving masturbation was apparently a turning point in his life. He often described how a college classmate obsessed with masturbation had sought his help. Kinsey claimed that he accompanied the fellow to his room, knelt, and prayed that the lad would receive strength to stop masturbating. However, reviewing Kinsey's personal diaries and letters to the Kinsey Institute, Jones concluded that this was not a friend who was plagued by the impulse, but Kinsey himself. It's just about to get weirder. So it talks about how this was not a friend. This was himself he was referring to, right? Kinsey prayed. But Kinsey himself, asking God to forgive him for the strength not to sin again. The Boy Scouts manual, along with the doctors and moral instructors, advised the boys to take cold showers to improve their health and take their minds off of sex. Neither prayer nor cold showers enabled him to stop this act. As a result, Kinsey was consumed by guilt. Kinsey's interest in scouting appears to have been similar to that of the movement's founder, Sir Robert Baden-Powell. Similarly, married relatively late for his time and seemed obsessed with nude males. These and other similarities to Baden-Powell, who is also known to have nature photographs of young boys engaged in such activities as skinny dipping, and both noteworthy and disturbing. We continue. Patrick Boyle's expose, pederast, sex abuse in Boy Scouts. It's about to just get weirder, of course. This next part is interesting because it identifies the areas of interest. He calls it the Midnight Cowboys. Kinsey's interest in camping with young boys continued after college. His professorship in Indiana University, as well as field research in zoology, placed him in close contact with young males. They do talk about him having Ralph Forrest, who was a friend who was close to him, having intimate contact. He nicknamed him Mr. Man. There's a lot of intimate correspondence between the two of them. He literally goes through and is like, called cowboy homosexuals. They're hard-riding, hard-hitting, assertive males who enjoyed sexual relationships with women when they were available, but who turned to other males when outdoor routines brought them together exclusively in male society. So if they're a ranch hand and they are rallying horses, then they can do that. It continues to talk about if women are available. So that homosexuality was a definite yes if there were no women available. So, and that's what he's saying that he based his realities on in this theory, introspective of nature of the partner of whom relation is had. Sexual relations are held with women when they're available or with other males when outdoor routines bring men together in exclusively male groups. And then he points out that this continues in a number of histories into the adult years of marriage. But guess what? Kinsey has no actual data on sexual proclivities of pioneers, yet implied that homosexuality was very common among them. So if he had data on American ranchmen, cattlemen, prospectors, lumbermen, and farming groups in general, that it was sparse. So he never actually says any legitimate data in any of these areas. He just wanted to be nude amongst them to have these activities, just like the Boy Scouts. So in addition to that, on the other hand, dressing up as a virile male, cowboy, lumberman, etc., is common in homosexual circles where males in such manly occupations are viewed as highly attractive. This attitude has been evident in such cultural landmarks in like Midnight Cowboy, the movie, Village People, with the YMCA. Credible accounts of Kinsey's contact with such men are limited to his gall wasp trapping trips in Mexico. He did not speak Spanish and did not claim to have witnessed sex acts during those adventures, basically. In short, his sensational claims about alleged homosexuality among pioneers, cattlemen, lumbermen, blah, 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 lacked objective evidence completely. And he was then again sold out by people he worked with to say, we didn't really have any evidence. So, of course, it keeps getting worse. 2 male students. So this was explained, Kinsey's pedophiles. Like, he's engaging in training people to be pedophiles. Because that's, I mean, they can't just tolerate his. He's got to make them one too. Which is crazy because that's what we're like, well, if you don't contend to my pronouns, then you're against me. Well, it's kind of the same kind of idea that he wants to act out in these sexually outrageous ways. And in this, talks about having, on this trip, they engaged in masturbation sessions, group masturbation. Both the young men were trying to keep Kinsey at arm's length. These people are talking about how disgusting this was, and yet how tolerant they had to be of it, even though it was this disgusting. So it's insane to me. Here's a perspective that's super interesting. Asked what Braylon's wife thought about it, Jones recalled, "I can tell you that she didn't like Alfred Kinsey. She responded that they were just kids from Mississippi and that Alfred Kinsey hurt them." And in his recent biography, Jones notes, Kinsey bathed with his students, striding about camp naked. Confided one student you'd see him going to the bathroom and all sorts of things. He'd just take a leak right there in front of us. Professors simply did not engage in that sort of behavior with their graduate students. Yet Kinsey seemed totally oblivious to sexual taboos, as though he was determined to flaunt them. Kinsey had become a sexual rebel, manipulative and aggressive, a man who abused his professional authority and betrayed his trust as a teacher. Only a compulsive man would have taken such risks. This is similar to the things that we see nowadays. This isn't just by chance. This is by design, by Kinsey design, and it's disgusting.